is such a pleasure to see everyone here tonight. Our panelists are 4 of the electric boat employees who were interviewed as part of this oral history project. Before we start, I wanted to give you a little background on how the project came to be. I covered electric boat, as Betty Ann said, for the Day and the Current in the 1990s. The big story then was the decision in Washington to cut the Seawolf submarine program to 3 boats from something like 30 because of the end of the Cold War. It meant that electric boats' trades workforce alone would fall from about 15,000 people to 1,500 in the course of a couple of years. And I think many of you probably remember that time. Now, EB people don't always love their bosses. They don't always love the company, but they are fiercely proud. And as Mike Toner likes to say, they work harder than anybody, or most of them do anyway, he says. It was very hard in the 1990s to watch them lose their livelihood and to lose a project that they had been devoted to for more than a decade. It hit home for me in 1994 at EB's last submarine launching. As most of you probably know, the boats are floated off instead of being launched down the ways into the Thames. So it was a bittersweet day. It was in the midst of all of this Seawolf stuff. And as the boat slid into the Thames, the men and women in hard hats were reaching up to touch the hull, and tears were running down some of their faces. And it hit home for me again later in that decade, working for newspapers, another industry that has been severely affected by downsizing and by decisions about what's needed and what isn't needed. So I felt a lot of empathy for these people. Whether Seawolves were necessary or not, whether you think nuclear missiles are a good thing or not, this transcends that. So when Connecticut Humanities said they were sponsoring the Smithsonian's Way We Worked exhibit and were looking for local projects to connect to it, I thought of electric boat.
My name is Ken Brown. I came to Electric Boat in 1961, right out of the University of Virginia. So do you want me to?
Yeah, what was your first job?
Okay, my first job was in the SHE project, which was a project that wound up trying to make submarine components quieter, also the natural flow reactor, freshwater reactor water systems. And the main emphasis was to try to make the boats quieter so they wouldn't be easily detected. Of course, by that time, we were considering the Russians as the big enemy, and their submarines were much noisier. Our job was to make the S5G project, quieter, and it in the end became the Lipscomb. It was a 1 submarine class, but a lot of information was, as a result of the design work put into it, a lot of good information for future submarines was learned. And I was fortunate enough, I'd been in the Navy, I'd been on submarines, I went back to school on the GI Bill, graduated, and Electric Boat did not interview at the University of Virginia. So I had already accepted a job with Boeing on the Minuteman missile program. I decided I liked submarines so much, and I really milked submarines when I was in college. Every time I had to do a paper, I'd write about submarines, and the professors loved it. And that was probably the only time I got good grades. But so I decided to drive up to Electric Boat to see if they were hiring by any chance. And I drove up and went in the morning to the HR office. And I was immediately sent up to the S5G offices to meet Russell Wheeler Brown, who interviewed me and hired me that day. So I could drive back and and cancel out with Boeing, and came to work at Electric Boat. And some wonderful, wonderful people in that program, including Frank Rich over here, who was one of our mentors. We had Frank Rich and Russ Brown and Herb Berry and Jack Leonard and Jim Burns, and just a host of great people, a lot of knowledge.
And Jack?
My name is Jack Pillar, and I went to Electric Boat from Pratt & Whitney. I worked at Pratt & Whitney for about a year, and I got tired of the snowstorms in Colchester and everything, so I was working the night shift at Pratt & Whitney, so it gave me the opportunity to sit on Electric Boat's doorstep. And I sat on their doorstep for 2 weeks, and the manager came out and said, "Come in here." And he says, "I was getting tired of looking at you." So I got a job, and I got a job in inspection, and I was a Magnaflux inspector. And a Magnaflux inspector is, you look for cracks in the hull and the frames that are welded to the hull. You use a magnetic yoke with iron powder. And I did that for about a year, and then I worked myself up to a structural inspector, and it gave me a lot of freedom on the boat, and I learned an awful lot from the shipyard workers that were there, and I learned how to read blueprints. I never knew what a blueprint was before. And one time I had the whole boat for myself to inspect, and it gave me a lot of freedom where, the other people, like welders, they would be in one spot all day, and I would be able to do the whole boat. And that's how I got at EB.
George?
My name is George Strutt. I started Electric Boat in 1964. I was 18 years old. I couldn't wait to get to work. My whole family worked on Electric Boat, so I knew it when I was a junior in high school, that's where I was headed. My parents couldn't afford to send me to college, so you're going to go to work. Well, I turned 18 in September. In November, I started Electric Boat. I went over there and I took 3 tests, and they offered me 3 apprentice programs: pipe fitting, ship fitting, and welding. I asked which pays more money, and they said welding. It's okay, I'll take that. So, I ended up, I went to school for 3 months, and it was during the winter. I'll never forget it. The first day on the job in February, they put me up in the North Yard blocks, wide open, 5 below zero. It was cold. So they put me welding tacking, and I welded and welded because it kept me warm. The whistle blew. I don't know what that was. All of a sudden, somebody tapped me on the shoulder and said, "You going to go to lunch?" I go, "Oh, that's what that was?" I said, "Okay," so I went to lunch. But I learned very quickly after that. When that whistle blew, I dropped everything and went to lunch. I ended up finishing the apprentice program. Then a year after that, I got drafted. I went in the service. I went overseas. I came back. My job was there. They requalified me. And I wanted to go back for the same boss I worked for. His name was Eddie Marazoni. He was one of the best bosses I ever had at Electric Boat. He treated me really good. Matter of fact, when I was in the service, he used to write me letters. And when I came back, they wanted me to go into the machine shop. I said, "I don't want to go to the machine shop. I want to go back on the boat and work with Eddie." Well, I went to the machine shop, and I ended there for 30 years in the machine shop. In the last 14 years, I ended up in education. I ended up 44 years at Electric Boat. One thing in my trade, everything was a challenge. Because when they put me in the X-ray crew, you knew you had to be good. And the guys that I was with, they weren't afraid to give me their knowledge. Of course, they give me the worst joint, which is overhead. That's where I started welding. And let me tell you, that's not a very nice place to start welding. But I had one little repair, and then they busted me on that one little repair. But overall, I said, my time at Electric Boat was very, very good. And I met a lot of nice people, and I see some of them here tonight, and that's part of my story. I'll get into the rest later on. Thank you.
My name is Wayne Magro. It's interesting to note, before I get into my story, there's quite a few of my children here tonight. And the problem is that during the 60s, I was always gone. So they came here to find out what's going on in the 60s. Well, let me tell you my story. I was married, had a baby on the way, and I needed a job. Right out of high school, I went over and applied and got accepted into electronics. Because of the missile boats that were coming along, they had a separate department, electronics. Not electricians. Any electricians here? It was electronics, 245, and it was always a difference. We were the better people. My first job, on the job, after the second day, I went with a gentleman who had been there many years, didn't talk very much, took me up on the top of the sail of the skate, and we replaced a TN 300 tuner for the radio mast. And that had a big, long whip antenna that used to come up. And he said, I'm going to show you this once, and then you're going to do it yourself. So I did a number of them as a mechanic. And I did have the honor of, if you go to the Nautilus Museum, the sail that's there, the 598, is a George Washington. When I worked on the new construction boat, that was my first job, installing antennas in that sail. I did go up until all through the 60s installing hydrophones and transducers on the exterior of the ship. So in the winter, it was tough, it was cold. But I do have one winter story I'd like to tell, and it deals with her father, Norm McIntyre. On the wet dock, we had a D-dock that ran out, and all the finger piers ran off it. And it was cold, and there was a boat parked there, but that area over to where the plate yard used to be was all frozen. And somehow a diver got disoriented, and he was up under the ice trying to break through the ice, and he couldn't. Her father jumped on the hook of the crane with a hammer and swung out there and broke the ice so he could come through. That has always stuck in my memory. After leaving electronics, I got into management and worked on the Alexander Hamilton as the first ship superintendent there. And then eventually working on 637 class. I'm getting ahead of myself. I worked on the 41 for Freedom, the Tecumseh and all those. And then I had an opportunity to go north and build a submarine in the woods. And I did that for 5 years. We built a 637 hull shape in the middle of the North Woods and took a critical. I came back then to work on the Tridents, and I was able to become the manager of ship managers for all of the Tridents and delivered the 18 that are at sea right now. Amazing ships. They just extended them to a 42-year lifespan. After that, I was tapped to be the program manager for Seawolf and delivered 2 of those ships before I retired. And that was a great joy because it was probably the best job I had for the 5 years in that position. And Frank Rich was there originally. He started it, and I just followed in his footprints.
I only lasted 8 years.
Yeah. And then I retired in 1999. And I have to say, I've made a lot of good friends, met a lot of good people. There are some that stick out as my mentors. And in the electronics department, it was Leo Penniman. And then when I became a ship manager, it was Vic Burdick, if people remember who he was. Yep. And then Owen O'Neill was the works manager. He's the one that made me the ship manager, and I did 5 PSAs in 1 year. That's why the kids are all here. They say, where the hell have you been all these years? And then the last was George Lucas. He was a mentor to a lot of people. And I appreciate what Electric Boat has done for me. I'm very happy with what I'm doing now. I've been out 19 years, but I still dream about the place. Unbelievable. That's my story.
Well, I was in the SHE project, and our job really was to get the components for this submarine project we were working on and get them as quiet as we could and to meet all the requirements of the naval reactor systems people. And they came up periodically to review the work we were doing, and we were in the process, of course, of writing the specifications and having these components built and delivered. We had to make a lot of trips to the vendors' facilities to make sure that things were on progress and going to make the time schedule. and meet the budget, which things never really seem to work out to meet the budget in that project. But and then we had an amazing thing, if any of you haven't seen it, was in the old days we had wooden mock-ups. And I know Frank was intimately involved with the wooden mock-ups. And these were full-scale mock-ups in wood of the engine room and reactor compartment on the submarine. So that when you had the design for the component you were working on, if it was a main feed pump, they could build wooden models of it, put it in there, have the sailors come in and see if they could take that model apart and rig it out. And it was an enormous tool, but it was a beautiful thing. If you liked woodwork, you just couldn't wait to get back down to see if they had put your component in yet, and to see if it worked, and see what you had to have done to make it work if it didn't. So that was of the early days of the 60s. And then I was fortunate enough, as the 5G project wound down, to move over to the NR1 project in the latter part of the 60s, and that was really fascinating. The story we were told, and Frank probably knows it better, but we were told that Rickover wanted a deep diving research submarine, and he didn't want to spend any money on it to speak of. He wanted to have simple commercial projects, and the words he used to one of our managers was window type air conditionings, for example. Well, if you can imagine something that goes down 4,000 feet with a window type air conditioning unit. But anyway, that was the thought that went into it. And trying to get components and design the engine room and reactor compartment for that ship was a real challenge. And there were some relaxation on accommodations and that sort of thing in the ship, but everything else, because of the pressures, the space confinement, all the equipment that had, was quite a challenge to get done. And I can remember one of the most memorable nights is being in the project. I had to spend a lot of time on the NR1 as the components I had developed were being tested. And I was down there one night when they needed to come up with a simulation for the sanitary tank. They needed to figure out how the sanitary tank would be emptied, and they couldn't come up with any idea. Finally, some guy said, "Hey, dog food." And so they went off and got a couple of cases of dog food. And they're the guys sitting down there, opening cans of dog food, dumping in the sanitary tank, getting it all filled up, swashing it around, and then trying to pump it overboard. And you thought, in that, it was very confined down there. There wasn't much air. The dog food it was awful. It was really, you were glad to see it go. So that's my story.
A typical day when I started at EB, of course, I was never knew anything about shipbuilding. And in the South Yard is where they had what they call the blocks. And this is where they did all the fabrication of the hull sections and the frames. They had the presses and the machinery to take a flat steel plate and roll it. And that's where they would weld it up and bring it out to the boats. At that time, I was doing the magnafluxing, and in the winter, of course, like they said here, how cold it is, and they had to heat the metal up to 200 degrees before they could weld it. So, of course, I would try and get in an area where there was a lot of heat, just like everybody else. And then when I graduated from the magnafluxing, I went into the die checking. And I used to do die checking on the hull inserts and the main shaft seals. So a typical day was a good day, okay? I enjoyed what I was doing. I learned an awful lot from the old timers down there, so that was my day.
And George?
A typical day for me was my father waking me up in the morning because I was living at home in the beginning. And we'd carpool together, me and my father and one of my brothers, actually. When we got to EB, when the whistle blew, we met with the foreman. And the foreman would give you an assignment, what your job's going to be for the day. So we all marched down to the wire room. The wire room is where you get your electrodes to weld. So we go there, and if you're in the back of the line, you've got to hang around a little bit and wait for the wire. And then we go on the job. Now, sometimes when I got on the X-ray crew, you went on a job and make sure everything was right, make sure the heat was up. Like you're saying, there's been times in the beginning it was so cold, because you got to understand, the waves were wide open. It was so cold they couldn't get it up to heat, and we couldn't weld. Sometimes they send you home because it's just so cold that you couldn't do it. But the times that it was, we start welding, and about mid-morning, there's no such thing as break time, but we all take a break. Trying to find a warm spot and take a break was tough. So a bunch of us got together on the blocks, and we had our lockers like in a circle, and inside the lockers we have strip heaters. And inside one of the lockers, sometimes we have a coffee pot, and sometimes the guys would bring donuts in, and we have a donut. It wasn't what you're supposed to be doing, but it was a place to go and get warm and take a break, and that's what we did. And so then at lunchtime, usually at that time, every 4 hours, you had to turn in your electrodes, because the moisture would get out into your electrodes, and you had to turn it in. Then we get new electrodes. So we go down, we get more electrodes, we have finished the job, end of the day. End of the day was a treat for me the first time. I didn't realize, but a whistle blew, because you had to go up on the main yard hill, that's where we punched in and out. And everybody ran. I mean, they ran because you wanted to get out ahead of the traffic. And the first day I was walking out, you didn't walk because you get run over. And they wouldn't run you over to get out of there. So everybody would punch out, the second day, I was running right with them. And that's how you run every day. You go to the car, I waited for my father, we hop in the car, and we try to get out before. Don't forget, there was tolls still on the bridge. So you wanted to get there early for you wouldn't be in the lines for those tolls to go over the bridge.
A typical day for me would be, we used to install wireways and then install the components that went in the wireways, and whether it was in a ballast tank or a topside on a FBM. The first job I did doing wireways and installing transducers and hydrophones was on the George Washington, under the superstructure. And it was getting on to late in the year, and it was getting cold, and you always wanted to be under the superstructure because it was black and it was nice and warm under there. But we would have to lay out the wireways, then go get a welder and install them. We built them, we fabricated them, but then we'd have to install them, be it pans or angle bar, and then we would run the component from where it was installed and plug it into the hull. At that time, in the early days, they used to penetrate the hull right through. And as we went later on in development, we had hull fittings that had multiple plugs on them. You'd put one hole in and you could plug a number of cables in it. And up on the ways, we used to do what they call the conformal array, and it went around the bow of the ship, and it was all hydrophones. And we had to take and measure from the one at the bow to the last one in a row, and we used to cut all those cables off hull. And we did that for a number of, there was probably 250 hydrophones. And the day that my boss gave me my first class raise, I had to tell him I had cut 250 of them too short.
Yeah.
But I still got the raise. We worked many long hours changing the label plates, so we got it fixed. Just like everybody else, it was cold. We'd go work for a while until our feet or our hands got numb, and we'd go read the plans. There used to be a plan file on the wet dock. We'd go read the plans to warm our toes. But in the later years, when I became a supervisor, it was a little bit easier at that time to walk through the boats, and I was always inquisitive. I was never satisfied pulling cable or installing antennas. I wanted to know how the boat worked. So I wasn't afraid to go down, ask somebody, what are you doing? What does this do? And one of my early mentors I mentioned before, Vic Burdick, we worked in the Graven Dock area, and at night we'd walk through the machine shop, and he'd point to that. What is that? What is that? What is that? So my friend David Shannon and I used to get up early in the morning, go down there, go through the shop, read the plans. We learned about main seawater valves, we learned about torpedo tubes, and we thought we had it made. But every time he'd find something, what's that? We had missed it, right? But we did learn an awful lot, and that was his way of the school of the boat. He was teaching us what the components look like when they come in, a block of steel, and what they look like when they go out and are installed in the submarine. So you would know the system, what it looked like, where it went. And that encouraged me to do more on my own as far as going in and looking at the rest of the boat and how, understood how it operated. So part of my day, typical day, would be that. I'd go down in the engine room. I got to tell you, Elio Patagna was one of the guys. As a young snot-nosed superintendent, I used to go up and beat on his desk. Christ, we need more people. We got to do this, got to do this. And he'd say, come here. Look out his office window. He said, you see any boats down there with plants planted on them or flowers? He says, there's no boats hanging around here. They're gone. So what he really taught me was everything gets done in its time. But you can't rush it. You got to make sure you do it right. You got to make sure that you understand what you're doing. And he not only mentored me in the shipyard that way, when I went to the site, he would come up and help me build a submarine in the middle of the North Woods, because he was really the expert on doing it.
I was very fortunate because being an apprentice, I had a teacher named Earl Stratton. Earl Stratton was my mentor. You know, he instilled on me, always go by the procedures. They're there for a reason. You know, like we had to heat the hull up to 200 degrees. We couldn't start well past if it was over 300 degrees. There was a reason for that. No matter how much time you wanted to go down and start welding right away, you always had to measure that. He instilled in me to go by the procedure because of the reason. One of the reasons you want to do that, you want to make sure that metal went back the way it's supposed to be. Because he mentioned the George Washington, they had a lot of cracking problems. That's when they first came up with putting the preheat on. But that man installed to me to always go by the procedures because there's a reason for it. And that made me a better welder. You know, when I had a problem, as far as welding goes, I always went to one of the old timers and asked him, I said, you know, something's not right. I don't know, I'm getting arc blow, I'm doing something. So they would come down with me and they would show me how to do it. There's always a little trick. In my trade, there was a lot of tricks to the trade. And they weren't afraid to tell me that. As years went by, I tried to install that with a lot of younger people because it worked for me, and I hope it works for a lot of the younger people because I ended up, you know, teaching welding for a while. So that's one of the things that always stayed in my mind was this guy, Earl Stratton, being one of the best instructors and my mentor down at EB.
My first mentor was a gentleman named McDougal, and he was, I want to call him an expert on the magnafluxing. And we used to have to, what they call the wet method on magnafluxing. And we used to have to do the bolts and the nuts that held the steam generators in the nuclear reactor room. And EB didn't have a setup or a system to do that, so we used to go to Hartford Manufacturing in Groton, and they had the stuff that we needed to do. And he taught me all of that. And then when I went from the magnafluxing to the structural inspector, we had some old-timers in the office that taught me how to read the blueprints, brought me out on the boat, and showed me the different things that you had to look for. And one of the things you had to look for, all your boats were on a declivity. And sometimes these ship fitters would forget to use a declivity board, and they'd weld in a foundation. And if the boat got launched and leveled off, the foundation, instead of being level, would be this way. So I had to make sure that these things were put in by the declivity board. That was one of the things they taught me to look out for. And, you know, I'm going to say I had a very good opportunity being an inspector because I had the freedom of the whole ship. And I talked to people all the time, and I self-taught myself on that boat. And I learned an awful lot about the boat, what different systems, piping, electrical, whatever, how things worked. And I attribute that to a lot of the elderly gents down there that had a lot of years' experience and showed me the ropes.
I was fortunate enough to have a lot of mentors. When I went into the program, there were a number of men that had been there before for quite a while, actually had started out the project, and they were all great. Russell Wheeler Brown was probably one of the greatest engineers we had as far as taking a problem and melding it down so you could understand it. He taught a class to study, do your preparatory work, studying for your professional engineering license. And the reason he taught that was he was so good at taking complex problems like they give you on that test and breaking it down to simple ways to understand it and attack the problem. They also had to help us. We had a number of guys in my position, young engineers that had just come aboard, how to deal with our customer. Our customer, Naval Reactors, was probably the most difficult outfit to deal with, very demanding, no excuses. Everything had to be on time and supposedly under budget. And they taught me and the fellows that I was working with how to get along with these people and do the job and get the components and parts ready for the ship on time. And that was a tremendous help. I don't know. I think it might be the component, the ships, the submarines. They're interesting. They're fascinating. They get guys like George Lucas, Frank Rich, guys like that to come and work for them. And it's a great project.
George Lucas used to stand up on the desk.
Oh, yeah. See that, George? They all know about you. George is a unique, let me just break for, George is a unique character. You ought to try to meet him if you haven't before you leave.
He was a history major in college.
Yeah. I told Barb, in my opinion, he was the most popular man at Electric Boat. Everybody knew George. Yep. And I don't know how the heck he did it, but everybody knew him, and if you wanted something done, you got George to go get it done, and nobody got mad about it. It was an amazing thing.
And he never tied his shoes.
Yeah. I know Wayne would remember, but at his retirement party, we had a picture blown up, and it was George finally getting a break on the Nautilus overhaul to lay back and rest during a lunch hour when the guys had gone off the boat. And you can't see anything for the asbestos dust, because in those days, we didn't know about the dangers of asbestos, and they were ripping out asbestos to take piping out. And there's George sound asleep on his break with this dust just all over the place. But anyway, I think that's why so many of the people from Electric Boat you would consider characters. And without a doubt, boy, did we have a bunch of characters. And some of the greatest people in the world. You just couldn't. I think the most amazing thing to me, and I'll bet the guys agree with me, when you stood at the top of that hill in the morning or the evening, you saw the people walk in and out, and you thought, hey, boy, what a bunch of. But boy, when you got to know those guys, they knew so much, and they worked so hard in such lousy conditions to get these things built right. It was very satisfying.
I think George was sleeping so much because I remember a job once I was doing, it was like 3 o'clock in the morning, and I turned around and somebody's helping me drag out my leads. Probably George don't remember me, but there was George helping me drag out that lead.
He helped everybody.
He did. He did. And you're right, he probably was the most popular guy at EB.
Yeah.
Speaking of characters, we had nicknames, a lot of nicknames down in the yard. Hydraulic Joe was one of the nicknames. We call him Hydraulic Joe because
the Indian, the welder.
His coveralls were always greasy and oily. Reason why he hung on to those coveralls so much, because if you turn them back in the wash, you never get a pair back. So we used to call him Hydraulic Joe. Then we had a grinder chipper named Potato. We call him Potato because he used to had a garden, he used to bring potatoes in. Then we had a guy to call Bleachy. Now, Bleachy was a character. Bleachy probably was the biggest bookie in the yard. He got the nickname of Bleachy because he used to sell bleach water during World War II. He used to make bleach water in his tub and he'd go around selling it. And then we had, and I won't tell you what this guy did, but a guy named Cadillac Joe. People remember Cadillac Joe. The reason they call him that because he drove a Cadillac to work and back. But I won't get into what he was. But at one time, you probably could buy anything at Electric Boat. And I mean anything. But they were all characters. But when it came to work, those characters were really good workers.
Even though they went to rags at lunchtime.
Yeah, I went to rags, yeah.
Well, there's a couple that stick out, and who was a ship superintendent named Cigar Bill.
Yeah.
And if you met him outside, without the cigar, his lip was like this, you know? I saw him cleaned up one time, and I didn't recognize him, but I looked at him, there it is, right? And he carried around a homemade fire extinguisher with him, and he made out of a plastic bottle. And he used to demonstrate it to anybody who wanted to see it. You should have one, you should get one, I'll build it for you. And then there was Raincoat Charlie. He was a good machinist, but he wore the same raincoat for years. Dirty, ripped, terrible. So one day we were over at the State Pier on one of the boats over there, and here we're putting in antennas and the machinists are putting in the masts, and one of the officers come up and he had recognized Raincoat from other jobs. He said, I can't stand it any longer. He took his coat off, threw it in the river, and gave a brand new alpaca coat. I thought Raincoat Charlie was going to cry. That was his favorite coat. And then we had a guy, I don't know his name, but during the summer, he'd go down to the North Yard Ways and swim off the ways. And there's some rumors that he took baths there also. And he did that for many years, right up until it got so cold he couldn't stand it, but he'd be in the water. Then, of course, Lucas again, right? Nice guy, Lucas. What they used to do to his Volkswagen was terrible, right? They used to put it on top of buildings. They'd put it down in the basin. They'd move it to where it shouldn't be and complain about it.
I like the product. I stayed in touch with some of the students I went through engineering school with, and they were working for companies that made widgets or whatever, and you were rewarded if you increased the number of widgets or brought down the price or made them prettier or something. But it was just one more thing, one after the other. Submarines all had a different personality. During the heyday there in the yard, we were doing 3 688s and 1.5 Tridents a year. There was always a submarine getting ready to launch, and the day after it launched, we'd roll the other 2/3 of the other boat from the upper ways down to the launch ways, and the program just kept going. So it was always something dynamic happening in the yard. I can't really at this time think of many things I disliked about Electric Boat. I enjoyed working there. It was a real challenge. I'm sure at the time there were, but I can't remember any.
Myself, I can't think of anything that I didn't like about EB. Of course, you did a lot of moaning and groaning.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. But I always enjoyed being down there. Always enjoyed learning. And like I said, I can't think of anything that I disliked about Electric Boat. All right. I liked the fact that I was an inspector, and it was my job to make sure that everything was right to the best of my ability. And I did that job. and I thought I did it very well. And that's why I enjoyed doing it. And I enjoyed working with all the trades, the ship fitters, the welders, everybody. So that's what I liked about Electric Boat. It taught me an awful lot. And that's it.
I think probably the best thing Electric Boat personally would have done to me is give me a lot of self-confidence in my ability, especially in my trade. I think it taught me a lot of lessons of life, actually, because, you know, and one of the nicest thing about Electric Boat is the lifelong friendships that I made. You know, to this day, every once in a while, I get together with a group that I work with, and we have breakfast, or we have coffee, we have lunch, and we just kind of talk about things in the past and reminisce things. But that was one of the best things about it, is the people of Electric Boat. You know, rough as the place it was, everybody got along with the family. You know, we used to have Christmas parties. We used to play baseball. We always challenged another department with baseball. It was really a nice place, but it gave me a lot of self-satisfaction. I guess if I had to say anything about the least about Electric Boat, is beat my body up pretty bad. You notice I wear hearing aids. I mean, I've got, you know, all kinds of physical things, but you know, that's the nature of the game, because as a welder, you worked in some pretty awful spots and tight spots. And, but, you know, that came along with it. That's probably the only thing I can think about, at least about what happened to me at Electric Boat.
I have to second what Ken says. Watching this thing come to life, from flat steel, straight pipe, rolls of cable, then all of a sudden it's this magnificent machine. And what I learned later in life was that if you went aboard it, even though it was magnificent and you held your hand on it, it didn't have a pulse. It took those young sailors, 18-year-old kids, to bring it alive. And that's what I really enjoyed about it, was building those magnificent machines, then seeing those young kids take it to sea and make it do what it's supposed to do.
Myself, it really didn't. I think in the shipyard, you didn't have time to think about the Cold War. You were so busy doing the work you were supposed to do on the ship, and I never really gave that a thought myself.
Well, we, in the engineering area, we had to know that we were trying to make these, at least the S5G, as quiet as we could. We knew that we had a new reactor design, a natural flow reactor, and it was all to keep the boat quiet, and that was all to keep the boat invisible to the Russians. And we had a lot of information, tapes and so on the Russian submarines, and we knew which bearings made the noise that they generated, and we were trying to come up with better bearings. And we had a project down in the research building where we did distributed isolation media for mounts to keep the vibrations from going into the hull. And there was a lot going on, and we all knew that that's why we were doing it, to make these things invisible to the Russians. And when the crews were out there taking around trying to come up and sneak up on the Russian submarines, we wanted to make sure that they were as quiet as they could be.
And they were always watching us, too.
And they were always out there.
Every time we went to sea, the minute we got past the fairway buoy, there was that Russian fishing trawler watching us.
That brings up something. I can remember them, the engineers and designers, they were trying to come up with the quietest way in the sanitary tanks. If you went to the bathroom and you heard the plop. And they were trying to find a way to stop that, because if you were in silent out there with the Russians and
Silent running, yeah.
right, silent running, and somebody went to the bathroom and there was a plop in the water, they could pick that up. So that's what they were. I remember them doing the testing on that.
I think the I agree that, the Cold War wasn't so much on my mind personally, as far as, work down there, but there was a couple of things going on. We had the Vietnam conflict going on too, and I was probably more worried about that at my age, because I ended up there getting drafted. But one of the things that always stuck in my mind is the protesters outside. And always wanted them, I didn't mind them so much protesting, because I felt that, we were building submarines to defend this country, for they had the right to freedom to protest. So I had no problem with them out there protesting. But there were some characters that were protesting. They have the beating on the drums and stuff like that. But they never made me feel guilty about what I was doing, because I knew we were doing the right thing.
I agree, but early on in the Polaris program, there was that Polaris action stamp on everything, and that gave a sense of urgency to what you were doing. So once you got that involved in it and started participating in the construction, and you would come upon something that's already been installed with a big stamp on it, Polaris action, it got you saying, yeah, maybe I ought to get my tail in order here and move on. But once we got into high-rate production, it wasn't so much we were worried about the Cold War. It was we had a lot of jobs to do. And at that time, it was common for a team to go from boat to boat doing the same thing. So we were anxious always to finish what we were doing here so we could get to the next boat and improve on what we did. And in the thick of it, that's what motivated me. When Quonset Point got the fixtures, the Vevey fixtures, weren't they, Vevey?
Yeah.
And they were now able to build frames individually, cylinders individually, and hold them to precise dimensions and tolerances so the two would match later. That took away the cross-member support. That opened up the hull for modularization, when you could build a cylinder completely empty and erect it. I remember the first one came down, almost rolled into the ocean, right?
Well, almost.
And but after that, then that's because we used to build, actually stick build. I had to be a ship fitter for a short time, and I worked with a guy named Bill Shornaby. He had one glass eye. And when he looked at you, that eye would stay still and this one would move. We literally had to stick build from the bottom up. We were in a cylinder that, excuse me, that had the missile control center in it. First thing we had to do was put the potable water tanks in. Then it had to come through a big hole in the hull. We fitted that in. And once we got it turned over to the welders, then we actually literally build the deck like a puzzle. You had a piece here, you put it there, you tacked it in, and then you put the plate on top of it. And then you put the stanchions up, and then you went up to the next deck. And but with modularization, because, I'm getting ahead of myself, because the way we used to build them, that's how you had to build them. But then with the open cylinders and the dimensional control, that's what really led to modularization, where you can now build something out here while you're building the hull, slide it in, and it fits. Especially when you mated the hulls together with the things that crossed the hull butts, pipes. Wires was a problem, but that's been solved also.
Yeah.
That's the biggest change I saw, was when we were able to control dimensional and tolerances.
Well, being an old timer, I hate to admit it, but one of the other big things that of course enabled us to do what Wayne's talking about were the computer systems. I mentioned the mock-ups and how great they were, but boy, they were very time-consuming and very man-hour intensive. And when you got done, you just had a huge pile of wood. Once the design was completed and the boat was built, the mock-up was no more use, really. So along comes the computer, and they can design the whole hull. They can take a computerized robot and walk him right through, show the access, show how you can pull components. They can do it all sitting in front of a computer station. And that's how we were able to get so much of this modularization done. We came up with a gentleman named Don Steamer started a thing called steamer packages, where you went off and built pipe packages, put them in a fixture, just walked up to a missile tube and put it on, and everything fit. All the various pipes came around and made it up, and it saved all that time of having a pipe fitter bend a wire, run to the shop, try to take it through a pipe bender. It was just an amazing improvement. It all worked together for the modularization. So the computers are here to stay.
And the modules now are such that the lights are on in them when they come down from either Newport News or from Quonset.
My change that I saw was going from boats on the waves to be launched to on a flat surface and just being brought over and set in the water. The experience that I had in launching, I was on several launching crews, and it was just a wonderful thing to see the carpenters with sledgehammers lift that boat off the keel blocks so that it could be slid down the waves. You would never think that a ship that size, with just human beings slamming away at those keel blocks, wedges, and it only had to lift the boat very, very little, but just enough so there wasn't any friction on top of the slide platforms. But that's the change I see. I enjoyed seeing the boats go down the waves, and now they don't.
Well, now I thought it would be good to give people in the audience a chance if they have stories they want to share or comments they want to make. I thought it would be helpful if we showed some old photos and kind of built discussion around that. This one is Jackie Kennedy, 1962 or 63. Anybody have any memories of Jackie being there?
At that time, a lot of people don't remember, we had an EB band, okay? And that broke up around 1957 or 1958. But I happened to be in it. And when the luncheon that Jackie Kennedy was there, the band was set up pretty close. And to this day, I can still remember Jackie walking by and how beautiful she really was to see her in person.
In 1962, there were 6 of us in insurance. And at that time, we were going to be coat check girls down to the Hotel Griswold for Mrs. Kennedy. I'll never forget, they had 10 state police motorcycles, 2 sections of them. And they came up the hill in front of the hotel, went down, and then the limousines came. The door was opened, and in came Mrs. Kennedy. Now, we never checked the coats because the coats were set on a table. The FBI took care of them. However, at that time, they came over and they said to each of us, my position was, you stand here. There was a red phone here. And there was a stairway that went up. So she came in, and like a person who went to finishing school, she glided across that carpet. She wasn't walking, she glided across and went upstairs. She was 3 feet or closer to me, and she was a beautiful lady. The pictures really don't show it. Then, after she freshened up, she came down, and her mother and the party went into the dining room. And they had their lunch, and the ceremony was going on. And then they brought the desserts in. And I'll never forget that either. They were in the shape of the Lafayette. And then, when it was all over, Mrs. Kennedy came out. They put the coats on. She glided past us once again and went out. After Mrs. Kennedy left, we did go upstairs. I did take the programs. I took the matches because there was a couple missing. And Mrs. Kennedy was a smoker. So I go, oh, maybe Jackie, use these. Then there were several napkins. And, there's an usher's badge because that's what we were going to be called. And it was the greatest thing at that time, and it's one of my great memories of working at EB. And I retired after 35 years. But I agree with this gentleman here. There were challenges each project that I worked on, and it was a great time for me, and I thoroughly enjoyed it at EB. I made a lot of good friends, and many of them are here now tonight. Thank you.
Now, the next one is the old nuclear engineering building that's now coming down. Anybody work in that building? Anybody have any memories?
Well, I can start. I was in the S5G project, and we were about the first people to move into that building. And we were right off the cafeteria, and it was convenient for lunch, but the problem was when they started fixing the food, it wasn't lunchtime, but boy, did you get hungry, because it just waffled right in. But we were right on the first floor, and it was the idea of the glass blocks and so on were pretty good, except people got claustrophobia to the point where Herb Berry actually took out his window so he could look out without the obstruction of the window. He unbolted it somehow.
The next one, this is the Ben Franklin shortly after it was launched. It's supposedly this is January of 1966. I don't think it's that electric boat, but I thought this might be a good entree to if anybody has any memories of working in the cold.
Yeah.
You look at the ice and the snow.
My grandfather, who I talked about earlier, told me that there was times they could walk from New London to EB on the ice right across. That's how cold it got back then, 1914, 15.
Thank you for coming.